In this dark time, powerful interests are stoking the shadows of the human psyche and our lizard brain tribal instincts for scapegoating and othering. Facing this polarization and violence, John A. Powell shines a beam of light on how we can move from othering to belonging, to build bridges instead of walls. Few endeavors are more important and few voices more eloquent. John's background is too deep and wide to recount here. Suffice to say that he's had an illustrious academic, legal, and activist career. He's long been one of the world's and nation's leading thinkers and scholars on civil rights and liberties, race, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He's lived and worked around the world, and he currently directs the groundbreaking Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. John knows our current Constitution and laws were not designed to serve we, the people, but to protect the rights of some of the people and all of the property. Democracy is about inclusion, and the issues of race and class are intimately related. In these dangerous and polarized times, we need courageous leaders who encourage us to stand for what's right and what's just, calm leaders who illuminate the ways forward with compassion, leaders with a deep moral and ethical compass who remind us not to injure our own humanity by demonizing those who are different from us. What could be more important in this time? Please welcome John A. Powell, whom we're so honored to also have as a Bioneers board member. John.
Hello, my name is John Powell. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley and the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And it's a great pleasure to be in the company of Nina and Kenny, who are the founders of Bioneer. And I have a challenge for Bioneers, Nina, Kenny, and all of you. And we are in a very interesting time in the world. We're facing multiple pandemics, a lot of stresses, a lot of polarization. And in some respects, this is not entirely new, but in some respects, it's very new. Global pandemic, uh, racial uprising, climate change, just to name a few. And what the world really needs now, what the United States needs now, what we need in our personal life is a chance to both heal and come together. And I think the Bioneers community is really well suited to step into this space. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the context of bridging and belonging. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the context of breathing. I live in Northern California where breathing can't be taken for granted. The whole idea of COVID suggests the virus robs us of the ability to breathe. And of course, there's George Floyd and Eric Garner, two frequently marginalized people, African Americans, are faced with a place where they're not allowed to breathe. You may say, well, what does it have to do with you and what does it have to do with Bioneers? In my mind, one thing that Bioneers represent is the coming together of different communities, grounded to the earth, grounded to nature. It's actually a bridge which affords the possibility for everyone in all different expressions of life to belong. So how does that bridge work? Why isn't that bridge working better now? Instead of seeing bridges, we're seeing walls, we're seeing breaks, we're seeing fracturing, we're seeing demonstrations in the streets. We just had an election. And while some of us are celebrating, half the country is mourning. How do we actually heal? And it seems to me that bridging is the key to healing. At the Othering and Belonging Institute, we are very concerned about that process of healing. The good news is we're not the only one. As I said, Bioneers really reflect that itself, but so do people on the streets, politicians, companies, demonstrators. There are a lot of people who want the country and the world to heal. A recent survey in the United States said 70% of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, people who are not political at all, want the country to heal. They want to stop the polarization. The question is how. How do we do that? And we may feel we're too small as individuals, and we may feel that we only control our own lives. I want to actually challenge us on that. So bridging is basically a process where we recognize another person's humanity. There's a South African word called sabawanu, which means I see you, or Ubuntu, which means I am because you are. I am because you are. We recognize our deep interrelationship. And there's a lot of research suggesting that when people are seen, they start to heal. Just being seen, just being recognized is a deeply loving and healing event. And so what we're seeing is all over the country, people engaging in this process of bridging, which calls on us to see each other, which calls on us to recognize each other. This has a political dimension, cultural dimension, and certainly a spiritual dimension. My assumption is, and it may not be an entirely accurate assumption, that many of Bioneers actually are already leaning into some practice of mindfulness, mindful eating, dancing, connecting to the earth. And I think that's critical in order to heal ourselves and in order to heal each other. But I also want to push us to go beyond that. Because what we found at the Institute, while people gravitate toward bridging and belonging, they gravitate in such a way that it becomes a very individualized practice. That oftentimes you hear the phrase, in order to do something on the outside, you must first fix the inside. It suggests bringing people together so that people can see each other, and that's enough. While that's critical, it's not enough. And I want to give you two examples to demonstrate this. And one is from a book that we don't read anymore called Native Son, written by Richard Wright. And I'll give you a quick setup of that classic book. And if you have time and nothing to do on Saturday afternoon, you may actually read it. The hero or protagonist in Native Son is someone named Bigger Thomas. Bigger Thomas is a young African American, low income, who gets a job with this white family, among other things, being a chauffeur, driving the family around. And the family's daughter returns from college, and she's very liberal, about the same age as Bigger Thomas, and her boyfriend basically say, "We want to recognize your humanity, Bigger. We don't believe in all this hierarchy, that you're the chauffeur and we're the passengers." So one of the things they do is they say, "Let's sit up front with you. We're not going to sit in the back." That actually is a false hierarchy. What they don't notice is how uncomfortable this makes Bigger. That Bigger is extremely discombobulated by having these two rich white people sit up in the front of the car with him. Even though they're exercising a sense of goodwill, they're not acknowledging the cultural and structural impediments that makes it hard for Bigger to really connect with them. And then later in the book, they're driving around, and again, the white couple says, "We're getting hungry." And Bigger says, "Would you like me to take you someplace to eat?" And their response is yes. And Bigger says, "Where?" And they say, "Take us to your favorite place." This mortifies Bigger. He says, "No, I can't do that." He said, No, it's all the same. We want to see where you eat. We want to eat what you eat." And eventually, Bigger agrees, and he takes them to a place where he eats. And not only are they the only white people in this place, they're the only rich people in this place. And again, the whole place is abuzz with these rich young white people showing up at their place. They're doing this out of a sense of good intention. They're doing this trying to connect. They're doing this trying to recognize Bigger. They're trying to bridge. But here's the problem. They fail to recognize the structure, and culture makes it hard. And without addressing the culture, the structure, the power imbalance, bridging is very hard. So let me give you a more recent example. Again, if you have a Saturday afternoon, nothing to do, I recommend a movie. It's called Knives Out. And in this movie, there's a very rich family, and there's a caretaker, literally providing care to the family, who's from Latin America. And she's taking care of the head of the family. And in doing so, she actually gets to know the family. They get to know her. And at one point, there's a conversation among the family members about undocumented immigrants. And she's very uncomfortable because not only is she an immigrant, her mother, who lives with her, is undocumented. And she needs this job. She can't afford to live without this job. So at some point, the family members turn to her, and I think her name was Maria, and they said, Maria, what do you think? What's your feeling about undocumented immigrants, illegal immigrants? And she's mortified. What should she say? She needs her job. She loves her mother. And one of the family members recognizes that this is putting her in an incredibly awkward situation. Why? Because of the structure, because of the power imbalance, because of the culture. She cannot have an authentic conversation with them unless they began to address this. And this gets replicated over and over again in our lives. When we sometimes, out of goodwill, don't want to recognize that there are things that actually put us in different situations. So it's not enough to just say, I'm a good person. I don't see hierarchy. I don't see differences. Those differences are real. They're not biological, but they're nonetheless real. And so we can't just sit in ourselves. We can't just engage in internal work to fix these problems. These problems are inside and outside. Stories, we live in stories, and stories live in us. We live in structures, and structures live in us. And we have to actually be attentive to how those structures make bridging, make the ability to see each other very, very difficult. So part of this is to reject the duality between the inside and the outside. But there's another perspective. People who are engaged in social justice practice oftentimes would gravitate to what I just said. They would say, yes, before we can do anything, we have to fix the structures. First of all, you have to get rid of capitalism. You have to get rid of white supremacy. Tell white people before they come talk to black people to fix their own neighborhood. And so in this case, I think the problem is leaning too far in the other direction. We have hundreds of preconditions before we can actually come together authentically, before we can bridge. And so before I can see you, first of all, I have to have all of those power imbalances, all of those structures, all of those cultural impediments removed. That never happens. So we never come together. So here's the challenge. We come together, the structures are in place, and things don't always go smoothly. We wait until all those structures are addressed, we never come together. So it's a messy process. And what I advocate, and we advocate at the Institute, is that we begin with short bridges, and at the same time, we pay attention to structure and culture. We engage in a practice that centers our body, centers our mind, centers our heart, but we also recognize that we're part of the world. It's an iterative process. It's not one before the other. We do both at the same time. And we will make mistakes, and conditions will change. And that's what's called for in terms of bridging. And again, I think Bioneers are in the best place. That's the challenge I want to give to you. For you to be ambassadors for the world to heal, for you to help us bridge. One last thing before I end this talk. Some people are leery of bridging because they think, well, first of all, if there's bridging to be done, it needs to be done by those who are in power. And that's not entirely wrong. If you have more power, you have more responsibility. But all of us have power. All of us have agency. Not even, it's not symmetrical, but all of us can potentially engage in bridging. And so again, I would say, how do we actually start where we are? Recognizing that things are not perfect, they never will be, but we can begin to do the work. There's also reluctance to bridge because sometimes we'll say that person, whether it's a member of the KKK or an ardent Trump supporter, or someone who hates black people, someone who's xenophobic. And again, I say, start with short bridges, start with things that are easier, start with things that are closer to home. Don't start with the most difficult. But also, bridging doesn't mean we agree with someone. It's not predicated on the notion that I'm going to convince you that you're right or you're going to convince me that I'm right. It's predicated on seeing each other. It's predicated on being present. It's predicated on listening. It's predicated on compassion, which means to suffer together. Now, it turns out that the research shows that when we can do this, when we can be fully present with someone else, it not only transforms them, it transforms us. So even though we're not doing it for the purpose of changing the person, it's a very effective change agent. And the last thing I'll say is that there's a subtle thing in this, because if we use this bridging and being present simply as a technique, we've actually bastardized it. We're not actually talking about belonging anymore. We're talking about a strategy to convince someone that I'm right and they're wrong. And bridging is one of the most effective tools for us to heal the world and create a world where we all belong. And belonging requires that we co-create, and co-creation requires agency, requires power, requires love, and requires responsibility. And I'll end just by saying this: we are all responsible. Responsibility is different than guilt or blame. So we don't dwell on guilt or blame, we dwell on responsibility. And we are responsible, all of us, for creating and co-creating a world where everyone belongs, co-creating a future where everyone belongs and we belong to the earth. And that is a challenge I want to leave with you, Bioneers, to be ambassadors for bridging and creating a world where we all belong. Thank you.